For over 2,000 years, the name of Caesar has been a symbol of power and majesty. Kings and emperors, envious of his conquests and achievements, have cast themselves in his image, calling themselves Caesar, Kaiser, Tsar. But to some Romans, he was an upstart, a tyrant whose naked ambition would destroy the Roman Republic and pave the way for the rule of the emperors.
To know nothing of what happened before you were born is to remain forever a child. Cicero.
Rome, in the year 100 BC. At the height of summer, a young noblewoman named Aurelia gave birth. It was her first child, and it was a son. Friends and family brought gifts, and the boy was named Gaius, followed by the clan name Julius and the family name Caesar. As a child of the nobility, he was brought up in luxury. Under his father's watchful eye, he would drive a goat chariot, pretending to be a triumphant general. Rome was governed by such aristocratic families. The young Caesar was soon being groomed to follow in his father's footsteps.
As a 7- or 8-year-old, Julius Caesar had a tough childhood, a strict mother. Julius Caesar could expect to have been beaten for every mistake that he made. He's being formed, perhaps beaten into, a pattern of greatness.
Caesar would have been indoctrinated with the idea that his role in life was to pursue the highest political ambitions and carry on the family name.
This privileged education instilled in Caesar a sense of pride in Rome's past. Its legendary foundation on the banks of the river Tiber in 753 BC. The kings who were overthrown to create a republic. How the cities of Italy were absorbed one by one, and how, in the 2 centuries before Caesar's birth, Rome's armies had conquered North Africa, Greece, southern Gaul, and Spain. Physical training was as valued as schooling. After lessons, Gaius and his friends would head towards open ground outside the city. Here he learned the skills he would one day use in battle. At the age of 15, Caesar was introduced to political life, wearing the toga, the distinguishing dress of a Roman citizen. He accompanied his father to the Forum, the heart of Rome and its empire. Under the Republic, Rome had conquered the Mediterranean. Wealth was pouring in. But the Republic's very expansion was causing political instability.
Rome was an aristocratic system in which aristocrats competed with each other for election to political office, but the voters were the populace. Aristocrats competing with each other, with a volatile electorate, repeatedly in the last century BC called in soldiers to help them resolve political differences. The consequence was repeated civil war between rival political factions.
Caesar's father served as a senator. He was one of Rome's ruling officials, but behind the Senate's doors, his career was faltering.
Caesar was born into a very high-class family, but they seem to have lost something of their status. They were rather on the edge of the political elite, and Caesar was always short of money. It must be part of his motivation through his later career to restore this family name and to get into the centre of things.
Caesar belongs to a family that expects power, but at the same time, you've got a context of civil war, and I think the fact that Caesar grows up in a context of civil war is of fundamental importance. And his family is not doing well, and so you've got an expectation of high achievement combined with frustration.
When Caesar was still aged 15, his father died. He became head of the family.
Caesar's father died when Julius Caesar was rather young, and that left Caesar on his own. He had to work very hard to push his political career further, and I'm sure that was a great spur to his ambition.
At 16, he married to secure a match with the daughter of a high-ranking political family. But before he could exploit his new connections, civil war broke out again in Rome. It was a time of danger. Caesar's wealth was confiscated, and his life threatened by the faction which had taken power. He took flight from Rome and became an officer in the army. He would bide his time, but he was determined to return.
I would sooner be the first man in a barbarian village than the second in Rome. Caesar.
Caesar spent 4 years on campaign in Asia Minor, winning commendations for his bravery. By then, the political situation in Rome had changed. The teenager who had gone to war returned a man, ready for a new but very different campaign.
He was particular of his personal appearance, clean-shaven, sensitive of his premature balding, and though subject to epilepsy, his physical endurance was phenomenal. Plutarch.
Well built with dark, lively eyes. He not only had his hair carefully trimmed, but also removed his body hair with tweezers. Suetonius.
He was a terribly vain person. He could be exceedingly flippant. He's very difficult to assess in this way, but his vanity certainly comes through all through his life. Everybody knew he was vain. It's a spoilt child.
The art of public speaking was vital for an aspiring young politician. Thus Caesar sailed east to the island of Rhodes to learn from a famous Greek teacher of oratory. During the sea crossing, he was captured by pirates and held hostage on an island.
When the pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents, Caesar burst out laughing. "Don't you know who I am?" he said, and he volunteered to pay 50. Plutarch.
While his friends hurried off to ports to collect money, Caesar made himself comfortable among his captors.
Whenever he wanted to sleep, he would tell them to stop talking. He also read them his poetry, and if they failed to admire his work, he would call them to their faces illiterate savages, and would often laughingly threaten to have them all hanged. Plutarch.
The pirates ignored his threats, and once the ransom had been paid, they released him. But Caesar had other plans. He immediately pursued and captured the pirates, and ordered them crucified. Because he quite admired them, he hastened their deaths by first having their throats slit.
The Republic was a complex system which created a balance of power between citizens who were soldiers on the one hand and aristocrats. But it also was an extraordinarily clever system which created a balance of power among the aristocrats based on two devices. One, that all tenure of power was short and all tenure of power was shared, so that no one aristocrat could ever gain too much power.
Each year, 2 senators were elected to rule jointly as consuls. Consulship was the Republic's highest office and was open only to those over 42 years old. Caesar knew he faced a long haul. At the age of 30, he secured a foothold on the political ladder, an administrative post in one of Rome's Spanish provinces. While there, Caesar saw a statue of Alexander the Great. It dawned on him that by the time Alexander had reached 31, he had conquered most of the known world, whereas Caesar was dealing with accounts and petitions. He was so overcome with frustration that he broke down and wept. After a year away, he returned to Rome. His post in Spain granted automatic and lifelong entry to the Senate. As senator, he could now proudly wear a broad band of purple on his tunic. Purple made from crushed sea snails was the most expensive, thus the most prized of colors. The death of his first wife enabled Caesar to remarry. His new wife, Pompeia, brought him both a new alliance with a powerful Senate faction and a large fortune, essential to anyone with ambition. But Caesar was not accepted by the elite. Adopting a bold strategy, he turned instead to the urban poor and campaigned in the slums of Rome.
Life for the poor must have been terrible, dirty and short. The streets were crowded. Rome had grown very fast, so that houses were built higgledy-piggledy, and people were crowded in them in small tenements. There was no way of curing sickness. Although some houses were connected to main drains, many houses were not, and people simply threw their shit from the upper windows down into the street below. So you have to imagine streets which were dirty and crowded, filled with pestilence and disease, and the stench must have been overwhelming. Roman aristocrats used to go down the street with roses held to their nose.
As an outsider, Julius Caesar did what any shrewd politician would do. He found a different power base. He ignored the aristocracy and went for the urban poor, prepared to do what few other aristocrats would do, walk down the streets, shaking hands with ordinary people.
He showed himself perfectly ready to serve and flatter everybody, even ordinary persons. He did not mind temporarily groveling. Cassius Dio.
An ideal appointment was secured through these efforts: responsibility for Rome's entertainments. Caesar spent enormous amounts of borrowed money on staging the most extravagant games ever seen. The floor of the arena was flooded for mock naval battles. Vast numbers of wild beasts were imported from North Africa. 320 pairs of gladiators, dressed in silver, fought to the death for the crowd's amusement.
Caesar is what I would call a popular politician. He doesn't have solid support among the Senate, and so he turns to the people. Rome is full of, in a sense, floating voters, voters who are only too ready to take bribes and to follow whichever politician promises them most or puts on the most lavish games.
He was lavish in his spending and was thought to be purchasing a short-lived fame at great expense. Plutarch.
The debts were mounting fast. If his political gamble failed, he would face exile, even death. But he ignored the risks and continued to indulge his extravagant tastes.
Caesar is reported to have paid such immense prices for well-built slaves that he was ashamed and forbade the payments to be entered in the account books. Suetonius.
Days and nights were filled with deals being struck in the privacy of Caesar's home.
Ordinary citizens liked him because of the friendly way in which he mixed with people. Then there were his dinner parties and entertainments, and a certain splendor about his whole way of life. All this made him politically more and more important. Plutarch.
Men of all classes succumbed to his charm, as did their wives.
All agree that he greatly loved pleasure, spent much money in order to gratify his passions, and seduced very many ladies of quality. Suetonius.
At night, Julius Caesar is one of Rome's beautiful people. It's a series of lavish dinner parties, of great womanizing. At day, a different kind of man, a bully, a mafia thug.
A complex network of supporters was now established. Aged 36, he tested his public and private popularity by running for election as Supreme Priest of Rome. He staked everything on being elected. As he left home on polling day, he told his mother that by nightfall he would be a priest or a pauper.
To get ahead in Roman politics for someone like Caesar, you need to borrow vast amounts of money. That's what Caesar had done. And he would be able to pay it back through the patronage he would gain through success. But if he failed, he really would be in trouble.
But Caesar won. As Supreme Priest, he gained further prestige, funds, and an official residence behind high walls on the edge of the Forum. Yet Caesar was still determined to become consul, and he sought a political alliance with the two Romans who could deliver this prize. First was Crassus, an enormously wealthy aristocrat. The second was Pompey, Rome's greatest general, who had recently conquered Syria, Palestine, and much of the Near East. The three forged a pact. To cement the deal, Caesar gave his young daughter, Julia, to Pompey in marriage.
Pompey and Crassus are both extremely rich and powerful. Crassus is simply rich, but Pompey has just returned from the East. He's a very central member of the Roman elite, and he is the most important person in Rome probably at this stage. They need Caesar because Caesar's a danger, and they have either got to ally with him or destroy him.
In 59 BC, the wealth of Crassus and Pompey's soldiers ensured Caesar's appointment as consul. The new consul was reluctant to share power. He immediately mounted a campaign of intimidation against his co-consul, Bibulus, who was pelted with dung, assaulted, and forced to stay at home. The Senate was horrified, as Caesar ignored all precedent and illegally introduced his own laws. Rumor spread that he'd even replaced some of the treasury's gold bars with bronze copies.
What I think really offended the Roman aristocracy about Julius Caesar's consulship was that he used it purely for his own personal ambition. He wasn't interested in maintaining the fabric of the Republic. Holding the consulship was merely another way of self-advancement.
Those who opposed him faced the violent retribution of his supporters. The senator Cicero summed up aristocratic anxieties.
The monstrosity of Caesar's nature is concealed in his gay and friendly manner. No one knows what to do. If we resist, there will probably be bloodshed.
When Caesar was consul, he was completely disregarding of traditions and decorum and niceties of getting on with his fellow political senators, and they found this absolutely objectionable. More serious still, he resorted to violence. He had henchmen going around beating people up in the streets, and Rome seemed to be lawless.
Politics was a competitive, beastly affair in which your chances of being bankrupted or being killed were greatly increased merely by being in politics. Caesar was competitive. He was more combative and competitive than most of his people of his age, and he won. But he won by virtue of trampling on his political opponents.
When I notice how carefully arranged his hair is, and when I watch him adjusting his party with one finger, I cannot imagine that this man could conceive of such a wicked crime as to destroy the Roman Republic. Cicero.
Such fears for the future of the Republic would prove well-founded.
Caesar carried the Roman Empire beyond the limits of the inhabited world. Plutarch.
The Roman aristocracy was engaged in competition with each other as to how many wars they could fight, how many foreign peoples they could conquer. Julius Caesar conquered more foreign peoples than any other general before him.
As his controversial year as consul ended, Caesar prepared to take up his automatic governorship of a major province. His enemies in the Senate tried to have him appointed governor of the Italian forests and cattle paths. But Caesar had sufficient support to rebut this insult. He was elected governor of Illyricum and Cisalpine Gaul. He then also secured Transalpine Gaul. As commander of his province's legions, he had established an enormous power base.
He was desperately short of money, and he would do whatever was necessary to get an army that was behind him and would support his political career and get a triumph which would raise his status with the people. It was all about building Caesar's image. It was quite clear. All Caesar wanted was a war.
He did not wait long. In the spring of 58 BC, he intercepted and defeated a tribe called the Helvetii, migrating from the Alps towards Roman lands. Then, without the Senate's permission, he struck north, invading the unconquered expanses of Gaul. Caesar was determined to win a triumph, the honor of a procession through the streets of Rome.
One of the scary things is that they introduce this rule of thumb that you must kill 5,000 people in order to qualify for a triumph. So that's the sort of bottom line. You're playing around under 5,000. And doubtless enormous numbers were killed, but they're killed by a Roman military machine that doesn't even question the morality of conquest.
There were 70 triumphs in less than 200 years. Rome was committed towards expansion. The direction of expansion, the extent of its expansion was completely unplanned. It was the successive decisions of successive generals. The Romans were more vicious than any other fighters in the Mediterranean world. When someone rebelled, if a town rebelled, the Romans set out to kill every living human and animal within the rebellious town. They turned millions of captives into slaves and brought them away from their home territory to work in Italy. The empire was a cruel and exploitative system.
He judged his men by their fighting record, not by their morals or social position. Sometimes, if a victory had been complete enough, he relieved the troops of all military duties and let them carry on as wildly as they pleased. One of his boasts was, "My soldiers fight just as well when they're stinking of perfume." Suetonius.
Caesar's campaign was relentless. Over 60 tribes were absorbed into the Roman world. In 55 BC, he had been the first man to bridge the Rhine. Then in 54 BC, he became the first Roman to invade the largely unknown island of Britain. The landing on British soil was almost a disaster due to bad weather and fierce opposition. But Caesar made sure Rome heard only of a great success. Slowly, Gaul was conquered, and Western Europe became part of the empire. 8 years of traveling along stone and dirt tracks, eating poor food and sleeping rough. 8 years of maps, tactics, courage, treaties, executions, and sheer, brutal, bloody battle.
In the Gallic Wars, Caesar shows himself to be an absolutely brilliant commander and an inspired leader of men, always in the front line, always making sure to ride harder and faster, to be there first, to carry heavier loads than anyone else. He's also, of course, a shrewd and cultured diplomat.
He paved the way for his return to the politics of Rome by dispatching glowing accounts of his military genius. In these commentaries, Caesar thought only of promoting his own image.
Caesar had to do everything at once. Hoist the flag, which was the call to arms, recall the men from their work on the camp, form the battle line, address the men and sound the trumpet. As the situation was critical and no reserves were available, Caesar snatched a shield from a soldier in the rear, made his way into the front line, addressing each centurion by name and shouting encouragement to the rest of the troops. So ended the battle in which the tribe was almost annihilated and their name almost blotted out from the face of the earth. Caesar resolved to make an example of them in order to teach the natives to be more careful in future. Caesar had all their counselors executed and the rest of the population sold as slaves.
In just under a decade, he conquers the area of the whole of modern France, takes one look at Britain and decides rightly that that's not worth conquering. And then, on the back of these conquests, now a very wealthy man, he has the ability, the prestige and the money to make a success of politics in Rome.
The 50-year-old Caesar was much changed from the man who had wept before Alexander's statue 20 years earlier. He had felt the thrill of victory and the sweet sense of absolute power. In Gaul, he was omnipotent. It was a power he was reluctant to relinquish. His next battle would be against Rome itself.
The die is cast. Caesar.
Caesar had promised his troops land and needed to deliver. But the Senate feared the conqueror of Gaul and refused to help.
Oddly enough, the historical problem of Rome is not controlling commanders who are far away. When they're far away, they aren't a problem. The problem is when they come back again, when they come back with their troops.
His opponents in the Senate were still determined to prosecute him for his illegal behavior as consul a decade earlier. They persuaded his former ally, Pompey, that Caesar was out of control. The alliance between Rome's leading generals was broken. When the Senate commanded Caesar to surrender his legions, he was outraged and refused to obey. In effect, he declared war on Rome. Opponents like Cicero expressed the hatred that many felt towards Caesar.
This insane, miserable fellow claims that he is doing everything for the sake of his honor. Can it be honorable to hold on to an army without the approval of the Senate? How can it be permissible to begin a civil war for the sake of one's own honor?
Caesar wants achievement. He wants power. He wants to beat his enemies. Of course, that's built into the aristocratic ethos, that if someone humiliates you, you need to humiliate them. You want to re-establish your honor, your dignitas, your self-respect. And he enters a civil war in order to re-achieve that self-respect.
The choice was stark. Surrender his legions and face trial, exile, even death. Or fight. Declaring the die is cast, he crossed the river Rubicon, which marked the northeastern border of Italy, and headed towards Rome.
When he embarks on the civil war, when he crosses the Rubicon, his famous statement, the die is cast, it has two meanings. One, it's done, there's no going back. And it's interesting that he picks actually a gambler's term for this, because the other meaning is that the die is in the air and nobody knows which way it will land.
Word spread quickly. People knew of Caesar's brutal behavior in Gaul and feared the worst. His experienced veterans advanced south, tearing through hastily organized opposition. The towns of Italy feared the worst, but were spared. As city gates opened without a fight, senatorial opponents in Rome, like Cicero, felt increasingly isolated.
The country towns are treating him like a god. What ovations and honors these towns offer him. They are delighted with the cunning kindness of Caesar.
Caesar entered Rome to find his opponents had fled. Within weeks, Pompey had gathered loyal legions under his command.
It isn't so simple as Caesar and Pompey wishing to fight it out between each other. Behind them, you've got other people with their agendas, and that's always part of what's terrifying about the victor of a civil war. They're all the supporters behind him who all want their rewards. They're pushing. It's not just that he's pulling.
A civil war raged throughout North Africa and Europe. Caesar headed west to crush any legions that had declared their support for Pompey. After winning victory in Spain, he marched to Greece to confront Pompey himself on the plain of Pharsalus. Caesar, with 22,000 troops, was outnumbered 2-1. But once battle was joined, he proved the more skillful general. By deploying his reserve at a crucial moment, he crushed his overconfident enemy. 15,000 of Pompey's finest troops were killed, the rest captured. It was a decisive victory. Pompey himself managed to escape the carnage, fleeing to Egypt. Caesar gave chase all the way to Alexandria. On landing, the young Egyptian king presented the victor of Rome's civil war with a gift: the head of Pompey. Caesar was both horrified and relieved.
He may hold up his hands in outrage and say this is disgraceful, but strictly speaking they did a job that had to be done. And Caesar could actually say, well, I didn't do it.
In Rome, at baths, taverns and bread shops, the news spread that Caesar had been victorious, and that he had taken a powerful mistress, the new queen of Egypt. Her name was Cleopatra. Together, they sailed up the Nile like young lovers. The gossips remained busy as Caesar journeyed with Cleopatra back to Rome. They spoke of how, after a battle with a foreign king near the Black Sea, he boasted, "I came, I saw, I conquered." The people of Rome now wondered what his intentions were toward them.
I am not king, but Caesar.
In 46 BC, the 54-year-old Caesar finally felt ready to parade in triumph through Rome. The moment he had dreamt of since his youth had arrived.
And then he had the chance to ride in triumph through Rome, dressed in a purple cloak, with his cheeks daubed in vermilion. The cloak was adorned with suns and stars of gold. And underneath the chariot, drawn by 4 white bulls, was strung a huge phallus to celebrate his virility. But behind him there was a slave, who every time the crowd cheered, murmured in his ear, "Remember, you're just a man."
Of course he wants the rewards of fame and glory of conquest. But the fame and glory derive from the fact he's done it for the Roman people. That's the language which Roman conquerors always use. I conquered it for the people of Rome, and that is why they cheer me and support me.
Out of respect and fear, the Senate made Caesar dictator. Normally a 6-month appointment in times of crisis, he was elected for an unprecedented 10 years. The Civil War had severely disrupted life in Rome and throughout Italy. Government had collapsed. Retired veterans had been called away from their farms. State funds had been spent on armies and weapons. Rome was fortunate that no neighboring state had been strong enough to take advantage of its temporary weakness. Caesar worked feverishly to stabilize the Roman world after the years of conflict.
Caesar was accustomed to write or dictate and read at the same time, simultaneously dictating to his secretaries as many as 7 letters. Suetonius.
He rewarded his veterans with the land he had promised them. Then he initiated a number of grand public works: libraries, canals, a harbor. He also commissioned the replacement of the inaccurate lunar calendar with a solar year of 365 days.
Caesar's reordering of the calendar, I think, is a very nice example of the sense that the world around us has become confused and we must sort it out. And let's get this calendar right. We don't know which month it is and which day it is, and let's get it so that the year actually is a predictable length and there's no more messing. And Caesar actually does that.
He had fought for 30 years to reach the pinnacle of power. His life now was comfortable, but he had no real solutions to the Republic's problems. His thoughts returned to war. Preparation began for a huge assault on the Parthians, Rome's great rival to the east. Before leaving on campaign, Caesar increased the number of senators, repaying favor to those who had helped him during the civil war. The dictator had taken to wearing a toga entirely of purple. His birthday was declared a public holiday, and later, Quintilis, the month of his birth, was renamed Julius, July. A growing number of senators, even friends, became concerned about his ostentatious displays of power.
There were very many senators who simply could not accept what Caesar's position now was. He was a dictator and he was behaving more and more like a king. And the Romans had got rid of their kings hundreds of years before. The word king was the most dangerous word that could be uttered in Rome in politics.
He was also ignoring his third wife, Calpurnia, in favor of his foreign queen, Cleopatra. She had been housed in a villa with their illegitimate son, Caesarion. A statue of her was being erected in a new temple near the Forum. To many, this was un-Roman and unacceptable. But in February 44 BC, the people elected him dictator for life. His opponents were outraged.
Things must have gone to his head in some way. And then he claims or is given supreme power in a way which Roman aristocrats clearly thought was completely unacceptable. Mind you, we have to be careful, because the people who gave him the power must have thought that he deserved it and they could live with it. It wasn't as though all Rome was against Caesar. Only the leading aristocrats could somehow not bear, then, the thought of there being a single perpetual ruler. And having a dictator, which is what Caesar became, precluded other aristocrats from sharing the honors which they thought were their birthright.
The Republic had, in effect, been suspended. Even Caesar's allies began to turn against him. His arrogance had gone too far. 50 or 60 leading senators, including one of his best friends, Brutus, decided that Caesar had to be removed from power. They hatched a plot to murder him. The date of the assassination was agreed. The Senate meeting on the 15th of March, 3 days before Caesar was to leave on campaign for Parthia. Caesar set off to the Senate. He had already dismissed his bodyguard, declaring it better to die once than constantly to fear death. The Senate building was under renovation, so the senators were meeting at Rome's only stone theatre, built by Caesar's once great rival, Pompey. On entering the debating chamber, he was surrounded. His assassins drew their daggers and lunged at him, stabbing him 23 times. Caesar collapsed, pulling his purple toga over his head as he fell, so that no one would see him die. Five days later, at a lavish public funeral, his body was burnt.
Caesar is assassinated even by those close to him because they're scared that they can't control him. Their answer to why they murder Caesar is absolutely crystal clear. Libertas, liberty, freedom. And it may be a vague and indefinable concept, but if you don't understand what freedom's about, you're in trouble. And it's about for the Romans, freedom from the arbitrary rule of one person, freedom from not being able to say and think what you mean, what you want to say. And they were absolutely right that the rule of Caesar the dictator ushered in a series of absolute rulers who did deprive the Roman people of their freedom in a very fundamental sense. That's why they said they killed him, and that's why they were right to kill him. If you care about freedom, you can't have a dictator, you can't have an autocratic ruler.
I suppose Caesar was merely a brutal, successful, calculating and thoughtful exemplar of all that Rome represented. He was a better general than any of his rivals. Probably no better in some sense than Pompey, but he managed in the end to beat Pompey. He was more thoughtful in the sense that he passed laws which lasted longer than the laws of his predecessors. So I see him as the best of the competing political generals, but merely a political general, not a long-term emperor.
Julius Caesar's career seems to show that by now the old Republican system wasn't working. It seemed as if solutions to political problems could only be found through violence. And Caesar was one of the most successful exponents of violence, and he paid the price by a violent death.
He is the person who represents the hinge point between the old system and the new, who actually sketches what the new system is going to look like. Almost without planning it, I would say. It's the situation that dictates what one person in control is going to look like. And he does it for the first time. And it's because of that that his name lives on, and that the way to describe the man who rules Rome from then on is Caesar.